What if Hitler never invaded Russia? Picture the trains that never roll east. No summer columns slicing into the endless wheat of Ukraine. No frozen convoys outside Moscow. Instead, imagine U-boats sliding beneath a black Atlantic, wolf packs tightening a noose. Imagine Gibraltar under the Axis flag, the Mediterranean turned into a German-Italian lake. London still stands, yes, but alone, hemmed in by sea and sky. That's our pivot. Barbarossa never launches. The single biggest decision of World War II never happens. And the war, from that moment, mutates into something stranger. First, a quick anchor in what really happened. In June 1941, Hitler sent 3 million troops across the frontier into the Soviet Union. The gamble was simple and monstrous. Smash the Red Army, seize the breadbasket and oil of the East, and force Britain to accept a German-dominated continent. The opening months were catastrophic for the Soviets. Vast encirclements, whole armies erased. But then came the long road to failure, the slowed advance near Moscow, the winter, the return blows at Stalingrad and Kursk, and the collapse of German manpower and morale. The Eastern Front ate armies alive. For Nazi Germany, it became the grinder that made eventual defeat inevitable. Why did that matter so much? Because the Eastern Front wasn't a front, it was a black hole. It sucked in men, fuel, trucks, and time faster than Germany could replace them. It forced Berlin into a two-front war, the classic nightmare. And it also changed the character of the war itself. The brutality escalated, the Holocaust expanded, the Soviets transformed into an unstoppable mechanized avalanche that would eventually roll into Berlin. That's the real timeline. So let's break it. What if 1941 arrives and Hitler doesn't turn east? The non-aggression pact with Stalin holds. The railways eastward stay quiet. German planners shift their maps south and west. The goal? Strangle Britain and consolidate a fortress Europe. The logic is cold. Defeating the Soviet Union might be Hitler's dream, but ending Britain's resistance is the immediate solvable problem. If the Mediterranean Gate and the Atlantic Lifeline can be smashed. Start with Gibraltar. Operation Felix was a real concept on paper. Push through Spain, seize the rock, and close the western mouth of the Mediterranean. In our alternate 1941, with no eastern invasion draining resources, Berlin leans hard on Franco. Food, fuel, guns, a promise of French North Africa as a future prize. Spain's economy is shattered after the Civil War. Neutrality is expensive. In this world, Madrid blinks. Axis troops roll to the straits and batter the fortress. Gibraltar, the British keystone, falls. What changes? Everything south of Europe. With Gibraltar shut, the Royal Navy can't freely move between Atlantic and Mediterranean. Supplies to Malta, to Egypt, to the Levant become a nightmare. Now imagine Rommel not as a brilliant but starving desert fox, but as a commander finally fed. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, things he begged for in our timeline, arrive in bulk. The Africa Corps grows teeth. Italian divisions suddenly matter. The desert war turns from a seesaw into a steady push east. Alexandria trembles, and Suez, the slender hinge of empire, becomes a real possibility. The cascade keeps rolling. If Suez goes, British control of the eastern Mediterranean collapses. The Middle East lights up. In Iraq, where a pro-Axis coup briefly rose in 1941, German support might not be just whispers and rumors. It might be paratroops, advisors, and Stukas. Vichy-held Syria and Lebanon, instead of being occupied by the Allies, become bridges for Axis movement. Turkey, forever balancing, feels the hot breath of a triumphant Axis on its borders and edges closer to cooperation, or at least acquiescence. The oil of Mosul and Kirkuk beckons. Istanbul watches and waits. Meanwhile, Britain holds on. Always. This is the island that survived the Blitz after all. But now the pressure shifts from the air over London to the sea beneath the Atlantic. Without Barbarossa, the Kriegsmarine gets a different war. More U-boats, better trained crews, more long-range reconnaissance. Coastal bases enhanced. The Battle of the Atlantic becomes the war. Churchill called it the only thing that ever really frightened him. Now imagine the volume turned up. Could Germany invade Britain? Probably not. Operation Sea Lion was fantasy, even with air superiority, and Britain's coastal defenses were ugly and ready. But Britain doesn't need an invasion to die. It can be starved. If convoys shrink, if rationing tightens, if morale frays, the political pressure for some kind of settlement grows. Not surrender, that word never fits. But a negotiation, a ceasefire, a clause that recognizes a German-dominated continent in exchange for the empire. In our alternate 1942-43, that becomes thinkable in Westminster rooms thick with cigarette smoke and dread. Across the world, Japan moves. Pearl Harbor still explodes in December 1941. Tokyo's southern strategy doesn't rely on German timing. But here's the pivot. In our timeline, Hitler declared war on the United States, binding America fully to the European war. In this alternate, with no Barbarossa bleeding him white, he restrains himself. He doesn't need a war with the United States, yet. He needs Britain isolated, the Med closed, the oil question solved. So America fights Japan first and foremost, sending Lend-Lease to Britain but not mobilizing the full tidal wave for a cross-channel invasion. The Atlantic still bristles with American destroyers, yes, but without a formal declaration, Washington's focus remains the Pacific. The consequence? Time stretches. The war in Europe turns into a siege. U-boat pens expand. Wolf packs range further with new snorkels and radar detectors. The RAF and USAF hammer German industry, but without the Eastern Front draining pilots and fuel, the Luftwaffe holds on longer, better. Jet prototypes like the Me-262 don't show up as late curiosities. They arrive as an organized response. The air becomes a laboratory of future warfare, and every month the calculus of invasion gets uglier for the Allies. What is Stalin doing while Europe holds its breath? He is doing what he does best: building, watching, waiting. The Soviet Union in 1941 was rearming at a furious pace even before Barbarossa. Without a German attack, the Red Army continues to reorganize, to produce T-34s, to stockpile ammunition and trained crews. Soviet intelligence penetrates Berlin deeper. Diplomats toast the non-aggression pact, while generals draw lines on maps they never show. Eastern Europe remains a partitioned twilight. Poland is dissected, the Baltic states absorbed, Bessarabia taken, just as in our timeline. The difference is blood. No millions dead on the steppes. The USSR grows stronger in silence. And the darkest part of the real war, what changes there? The genocide of European Jews accelerated in the East under the cover of invasion and with the creation of killing fields and death camps. Without Barbarossa, the machinery of persecution is still there. Ghettos, deportations, terror. The regime had already murdered and imprisoned on a vast scale by 1941. In this alternate, the so-called solutions shift toward forced expulsion schemes, Madagascar fantasies revived, or toward a slower, grinding annihilation through starvation and labor across occupied Europe. The horror does not vanish. It morphs. The moral abyss remains the same depth. Technology follows the logic of resources. Without the meat grinder in the East, Germany's research pipeline is less disrupted. Rockets get more fuel and more tests. The V2 becomes not just a terror weapon, but a platform the regime wants to scale. Radar, jets, guided munitions, projects that were real but rushed now get time. None of this makes Germany invincible. It just turns the tactical edge into a strategic nuisance that delays Allied plans again and again. The question becomes, who runs out of time first? Then there's the atom. The Manhattan Project surges in our world because of fear that German physics might get there first. In this alternate, does America still pour billions into uranium and plutonium while fighting a Pacific war? Likely yes, but the urgency to drop a bomb on Berlin is less immediate if Washington isn't formally at war with Germany. Britain, clinging on, begs for it. German science, for its part, fumbles with miscalculations and scarce heavy water. If Germany holds Norway more tightly, if saboteurs struggle to reach Vemork, maybe the program advances a notch. But historians are clear. A German bomb by the mid-1940s was unlikely. More plausible is a German jet and rocket umbrella that can punish but not decide. What about D-Day? Without the Soviet meat grinder absorbing 2/3 of the Wehrmacht, Every Allied planner knows the numbers are impossible. You don't attack a fortress at its strongest wall. So rather than a Normandy in 1944, the Western Allies keep strangling, bombing factories, sinking ships, closing airspace. If Britain loses Egypt, loses Iraq, loses access to the Gulf, its empire frays faster. India's independence movement accelerates regardless. The empire was already creaking. A Mediterranean collapse just kicks it sooner. By 1945, no Eisenhower moment arrives. No victory parade in Paris. Just a long, tired war that refuses to end. So what breaks the stalemate? Perhaps politics? Perhaps practicality? Britain might, under a new government, cut a deal that leaves Europe under a German sphere while preserving the island's independence and navy. Or the United States, after smashing Japan, finally turns west with full fury, especially if U-boats have sunk too many American ships. Or, and this is the most uneasy possibility, everyone simply freezes. Picture 1947 on this alternate globe. Berlin rules a continental bloc from the Bay of Biscay to the Bug River, and from Denmark to the Sahara Fringe, propped up by puppets and collaborators, patrolled by secret police, covered in watchtowers and slogans. The Mediterranean is an Axis moat, from Gibraltar to Suez. London is still free, poorer, bruised, proud, independent, but the empire behind it is evaporating. Washington looks across two oceans and does the math of missiles and bombers. Moscow stares west, now a colossus that never bled out its youth. Factories humming, divisions drilled and ready, 3 superpowers. One continent under a boot, 2 others bristling with industry and fear. What's it like to live inside that Europe? Strict, regimented, surveilled. A Europe of ration cards and triumphal parades, of forced labor and black market whispers, of radios tuned low as foreign stations hiss through the static, cities rebuilt in ugly marble and banners, schools teaching a history rewritten around myths, and everywhere, small resistances, smuggled papers, underground churches, tiny cracks in a concrete wall that never quite stops moving. And yet the century refuses to sit still. Espionage turns the 1950s into a knife fight in shadows. Berlin becomes not the site of ruins, but the heart of a machine. Bureaucrats, rocket engineers, wiretaps, briefcases, diplomats who laugh too loudly. The space race starts early and differently. No astronaut flags on the moon yet, but orbital shots of 3 banners glaring at one another. German rockets that used to arc over London now point upward, rebranded as ambassadors of destiny. Soviet designers, never interrupted by evacuation and siege, push their own rockets skyward. America, freed from island hopping in the Pacific, pours its post-war boom into missiles and microelectronics. 3 clocks ticking, 3 hands inching toward midnight. Decolonization accelerates too, but with stranger sponsors. A German-dominated Europe backs independence movements that weaken London and Paris while trying to fold North Africa into its own economic circuits. The United States talks sovereignty and markets. The Soviet Union talks revolution and solidarity. In the Middle East, borders shift under new pressures. Oil is power, and pipelines are politics written in steel. The old imperial map doesn't survive this world either. It just tears along different seams. By now you can feel the tension, right? A world without Barbarossa is not a world at peace. It's a world with different fractures. Fewer cemeteries on the steppes perhaps, but more years lived under a permanent threat. No Normandy sunset in 1944, no Red Army in Berlin, no photographs of soldiers kissing in Times Square. Just a slow-motion stalemate, a cold peace with hot edges, and a Europe frozen in a victory that never quite feels safe. Here's the uncomfortable truth tucked inside this speculation. Hitler's choice to invade the Soviet Union accelerated his own defeat, but it also accelerated the war's end. Remove it, and you remove the timetable everyone used to get out. You trade a brief savage sprint for a long, grinding marathon. Midway question: what single move do you think would tip this alternate war? Gibraltar captured, Suez lost, or a U-boat chokehold? Drop your take below, and if you want more deep dives like this, hit subscribe and stick with us. So, did Germany win in this world? Not exactly. It survives. It consolidates. It builds a sphere so heavy it can't move without breaking something. And in that heaviness lies the seed of its end. Economies like motion. People like hope.
Locked systems rust, especially when they demand constant fear to keep running. The Axis bloc would face what all empires face: entropy, a long downturn, a lost war in some distant corner, a coup, a generation unwilling to salute on command. When that happens, 1958, 1967, 1973, the crack that begins the collapse won't be dramatic. It will be ordinary. A strike, a chant, a general who decides he's tired.
What about the Soviets? They arrive at the same destination by a different road. Immense, industrial, brittle. Perhaps they move first against German Europe once the balance looks favorable, or perhaps they sit, watching two rivals wear each other down. Either way, the post-war world becomes a chessboard with three queens, each terrified of the other's diagonal moves. In that fear lies a paradoxical stability until it doesn't. And the United States? In the Pacific, it still wins. It still industrializes at a scale the world hadn't seen. It still invents, still draws talent from every continent, especially refugees from tyranny. Eventually, inevitably, Washington turns to Europe not as a liberator marching into Paris, but as a banker, broker, and guardian of the seas, holding the line while waiting for history to tip toward openness. There's one last image to leave in your mind. A nighttime map of Earth in, say, 1952. Three regions blaze brighter than anything in human history: the American coasts and Midwest, the German-led industrial belt from the Ruhr to Lombardy, and the Soviet heartlands from Leningrad to the Urals. Between them, dark patches, borders lit like scars, and above, tiny points of moving light, early satellites, tracing the geometry of a world kept in place by terror, ambition, and the memory of a war that never quite ended. That's the fragility of it all. One decision in 1941, and you don't just move a battle, you bend a century. Maybe you save millions from one kind of death and condemn them to a longer, colder oppression. Maybe you trade a burning city for a smoldering world. History is not a clean ledger. It's a web. Pull one thread, and the whole pattern shivers. So we return to the question that opened this door. What if Hitler never invaded Russia? The answer isn't a victory or a defeat. It's a different kind of shadow. Longer, lower, stretching over the same roads. And it reminds us of something essential. Our world stands on the narrowest of choices. The past could have gone another way. The future still can.